Hello, everyone, and welcome to another talk of this Peru JConf of 2021. We're here with Reza. He's the program manager for the Java Azure program at Microsoft. And hi, Reza. How are you?
Hi there, I'm good.
Great. So he's going to be talking about how the Java can integrate into the Azure platform and how this is Java is actually a first-class participant on this, and how Microsoft is actually is first-class also citizen for the Java environment. So I leave you guys with Reza. Hope you enjoy this talk, and if you have any questions, just post it in the chat or I'll be reading them from him. And welcome again.
All right, let's get rolling here. So let me share my screen. If you don't see my screen, let me know, but I think things should be square, but if they're not, need to know sooner rather than later. All righty. Okay, let me start my slide deck. All right, so my name is Reza Rahman. I'm Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure at Microsoft. In general, I'm responsible for basically all of our Java offerings that are geared towards Java developers on Azure. But one of the areas that I actually work on is specifically Java EE or Jakarta EE application servers, and making that as robust as we possibly can. So actually, today's talk is really about that work. So it's essentially my day job and talking about all of the things that we do with Jakarta EE or Java EE developers in mind in particular. So there's my contact information. It's on the slide. The slide is actually available on Speaker Deck. If you basically Googled the title of this talk, you should be landing on my Speaker Deck account. And in my Speaker Deck account, this slide deck is already published and updated, so you can simply pick it up from there. And if you have any questions later on, of course, you can get in touch with me in any way that you would like. All right. So in the next 45 minutes, this is what I plan to cover. I plan to cover. I plan to talk about a little bit about the Java EE or Jakarta EE ecosystem, just for setting context. Then we'll talk about what the current capabilities are on Azure geared towards Java EE or Jakarta EE developers, which actually there's quite a bit. And then we'll talk a little bit towards the very end about the roadmap and what we plan to continue to do for Java EE developers in the Azure platform in the next semesters or months or years, let's say. All right, so let's start with a little bit of the ecosystem context. The reason I start here is that this is for folks that are in, let's say, the majority are not using Java EE application servers. Somehow they think that this is not an important context. For folks that are using this technology set, it's an obvious question why we're doing this work. But folks that aren't, I think there's some important context that they're often missing. The reality is that Java EE and Jakarta EE continue to be a very important part of the Java ecosystem and cloud, and frankly, a very important part of the technology set for Azure customers. So if you look at the numbers, and over here, I'll basically in the slide deck, I'm citing the 2021 Jakarta EE developer survey. It's one of the more relevant surveys for Jakarta EE as a technology, but frankly, these numbers are more or less reflective of the larger technologies, larger surveys that we have in our industry. So roughly about 25 to 35, 35 being the number that's reflected in the Jakarta EE developer survey typically. About a quarter to a third of all of these workloads still run some kind of are running on some kind of Jakarta EE or Java EE application server. So that would be either WebLogic, Webster, Webster Liberty, Jboss AP, Wildfly, Payara, and the like. And even if you are not running, and that's a very significant portion, right? That's almost 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 developers, however you choose to look at it. So it's an ecosystem that we definitely cannot ignore from an Azure and a Microsoft standpoint. Now let's set that aside for a moment, and let's say you're not using any of these app servers. The reality is that the work that we do to keep the ecosystem healthy, the Jakarta ecosystem healthy, is still relevant to you. The reason being that the reality is that a vast majority, almost 70 to 80% of Java developers are actually using one or more of these Jakarta EE APIs. So whether you're using Tomcat or Hibernate or ActiveMQ or Jetty, Jersey, CXF, all of these things fundamentally are either implementations or Jakarta EE, or they're building upon Jakarta EE APIs. Same is true of things like Quarkus and Microprofile. All of these things fundamentally come down to keeping Jakarta EE APIs relevant and strong, and being able to have offerings from Azure that bind to these APIs. Now, many of these applications are running on premise or on the cloud. More and more, they're moving to the cloud. So it's definitely something that we are keeping an eye on and doing as much as we can. The other thing to understand is that the Jakarta EE ecosystem is actually actively evolving. It's not a stagnant ecosystem. So the most important part of the evolution right now is that the evolution from Java EE to Jakarta EE as a technology set. The latest release of Jakarta EE being 9.1, and next year there being a release called Jakarta EE 10 that will actually include a bunch of feature updates. The last feature update that was in Java EE, due to its transition from JCP to the Eclipse Foundation, that was in Java EE 8. But now we will begin to see those innovations again happening, and most likely the patterns of the past are correct. It's going to continue to revitalize the Jakarta EE ecosystem and keep it vibrant, and perhaps even grow its adoption. So if you take a look at more responsible analysis, like this one from the Java and JVM ecosystem report from InfoQ, you'll see that it is a picture of evolution. Whereas things like Java 8 and Spring and Hibernate, these are in the late majority category. Things like Microprofile and Jakarta EE and Quarkus and Helidon, some of which you probably would have heard of during the course of the JConf Peru conference. These are essentially early adopters or emerging technologies, and most likely they will cross the chasm in the next few years from moving from early adopters into early majority. So again, some things to keep an eye on and things to make sure that you are addressing. We are not quite addressing Microprofile and Quarkus and Helidon in a big way in Azure quite yet, but we do plan to. Right? Our expectation is that early next year or sometime after that, we will actually begin to address these new type of Jakarta EE runtimes. And most likely what's going to happen is these technologies will move from early adopters to early majority. So they will begin to see in the ecosystem about that between 15 to 20% to maybe 30, a third of Java developers, that kind of shift and that kind of adoption. And that is a time where it makes sense for a public cloud platform like Azure to begin to take those technologies very, very seriously and begin to develop offerings for them. So we still are keeping an eye on that, but for now, we are more focused on the more traditional Java EE or Jakarta EE runtimes. So this is the current state in this regard. So this is basically a roadmap for this particular section of my talk, which I'll spend about 20-25 minutes talking about. So when we're talking about Azure, or in fact any general cloud, there are usually three different major pathways that customers take to move these type of workloads. One is virtual machines, the other is containers, and yet another is PaaS or managed services. So our target here is to fulfill, so whatever path you take, so whatever your pathway and whatever your source and target runtime, that you are enabled, you are not blocked on Azure, and then your pathway is relatively smooth. So we are doing work to enable each of these bits and pieces and each of these arcs or pathways onto Azure. And we'll see basically how we're doing that in the next 15 to 20 minutes or so. So let's start with virtual machines. Virtual machines are the most, let's say, stable and old way of moving to the cloud. Virtual machines are very similar to what you may be doing on-premise. Essentially, more or less, these are machines, virtualized machines that are running on the Azure platform as opposed to running on-premise in your environment. But aside from that, there's a lot of accelerators and a lot of services built around those virtual machines. So although an individual virtual machine looks very much like it is on-premise, there are things around it that are much more cloudy and much more dynamic in nature than compared to what you have perhaps on-premise. So along those lines, aside from just giving you virtual machines, which by the way, Azure has supported non-Windows based virtual machines for a long time, we actually have all of the popular distributions on Linux, and slightly a small, slightly more than half of the machines running on Azure are actually running these Linux virtual machines. Red Hat being a very popular distribution. So it is already turning the corner from being Windows centric to becoming a more Linux centric runtime. We're talking about Azure now. So aside from giving you these virtual machines, we actually do much more, because in a cloud environment, you can do much more. So one of the other things that we do is provide what's called base images. So the idea here is that instead of having you start from scratch and start from the OS and install Java and install your patches and install these runtimes, we basically give you predefined sets of these images that are just ready to go. So instead of saying, I want Red Hat Linux, you will simply say, I want Jboss. And we'll give you a base image, or I want WebLogic, and we'll give you a base image that already has the proper combination, vendor approved, vendor supported combinations of, let's say, the operating system, Java, and the actual runtime that you are looking for in a pre-configured way. Similarly, we can also target much more higher level use cases. So instead of simply saying, I just want a virtual machine, you can say, I want a virtual machine that has admin server enabled in it, that is ready to go and ready for me to deploy my applications. You can say, I want a cluster of WebLogic servers, or I want a cluster of Webster servers, or a cluster of Jboss AP servers. And all of that will be created for you, including the foundational infrastructure pieces on Azure, like your load balancer or your networking capability or basic firewall capabilities, network interfaces, as well as configuring the clusters themselves, in much in the way that you would have running on premise. So these are called solution templates, and we have a number of them. So we do have a relatively complete story. There are some significant gaps. So we do have a relatively complete story about supporting these Java EF servers on virtual machines in the manner that I just described. So let's dig into more of the details of that. So one of the most mature offers is WebLogic. And in all of these cases, we are not, as Microsoft, doing this work sort of by ourselves. We are doing this work by partnering with the respective vendors and making sure that the vendor story is actually surfaced on Azure. So in this case, we are working with Oracle, who is basically the owner of the WebLogic platform. So what we do is, again, simple base images for WebLogic, various versions of WebLogic, 12.2.1.3 and above, and predefined combinations of Linux, either Oracle Linux or Red Hat Linux, Oracle JDK, and then WebLogic. In addition to that, we are also providing, meeting all of those use cases that we talked about. So you have simply base images, you have a single running instance of WebLogic with the admin server installed. You can have load balancing capabilities in front of your cluster. And of course, you can have clustering and high availability, all through a sort of a WYSIWYG, a GUI-based interface. And you see a screenshot of that on my slide now. It looks very much like that. So you have a blade where you set up the basics and you say, hey, I want so many instances of WebLogic, set up the cluster for me, front-end it with a application gateway load balancer, or do integration with my databases, integrate with Azure Active Directory, integrate with Elk, set up a coherence cluster for me. All of those capabilities were built in. In particular, we support integrations like Azure App Gateway, all of the major databases on Oracle, on Azure, namely Azure SQL, Azure Postgres, as well as on-premise databases. We do support Oracle DB out of the gate in the solution templates. We do support Azure Active Directory integration through LDAP. We also support Coherence Web. So when you're creating the WebLogic cluster, you can also create a set of Coherence Web instances that go with that cluster. So you already have distributed caching built in. You can have all the WebLogic logs redirected to an existing Elk instance that you might have. And by the way, on Azure, you have an Elk-based pass, so Elasticsearch-based pass. So you can redirect all of your logs there. So this is a relatively mature offering. It's one of the it's where we actually started our Java EE on Azure journey. There will be more enhancements here and there. There's usability that we want to improve on some of these things, and also, of course, listen to your feedback and see how else we can improve these offerings, both the base images as well as the solution templates. And by the way, we have something very similar, not just for VMs, but also for AKS or Kubernetes. And I'll talk about that in a moment here as well. So for each of these, I do have the link to the solution templates embedded in the deck. So feel free to take a look at that when you read through the deck. If you're interested in this particular thing, you can click on the link that is highlighted on that slide, and it will take you to the appropriate offer. Similarly, we have a partnership with IBM. So we are supporting Webster traditional on Azure in the same way. So basically, this is targeted towards the cluster use case. And again, it's a predefined combination of Red Hat Linux, IBM J9, as well as the latest version of Webster. If you go into the marketplace, you'll see that it is actually published by IBM, but it is jointly supported and actually co-developed with Microsoft and IBM. And in addition to just supporting a cluster with the admin console enabled, by the way, so you can set up a cluster and you can log onto that cluster directly with the admin console enabled. Other than that, we also support a smaller number of integrations for Webster. So we support IBM HTTP server as a load balancer, and we also could potentially look into supporting some of the more major integrations like databases, for example. But once you have the cluster created, you can, of course, do all of these integrations by yourself as well. And again, we are working with Red Hat to also support some variant of Webster on AKS as well as ARO, or Azure Red Hat OpenShift. We're not supporting Webster traditional on those platforms, but we are supporting Liberty, and I'll talk about that in a second. And again, you can see the screenshots, both a marketplace entry once you search the marketplace or search the portal, and of course a UI, a screenshot with the UI there as well, and of course again the link there if you want to try this out. Jboss AP on Azure, again similar story, and in this case the partner is Red Hat. So we are again providing out-of-the-box solutions for getting up and running with a cluster of Jboss AP servers with predefined sets of Oracle Red Hat Linux, OpenJDK in this case, and Jboss EAP. You can set it up as there is a standalone set of servers, or maybe just one standalone server, or in cluster configuration. So there is both configurations, as you may know, if you're a Jboss Red Hat user. All of these offers, by the way, are bring your own license. So you have to start the cluster. We do not do anything with the licenses. You have to ensure that you're properly licensed with either or IBM or Oracle or Red Hat. However, in some of these cases, in particular in the Jboss AP on VM's case, we could look into supporting, for example, some kind of pay-as-you-go model. So maybe you're not a Jboss customer right now, but you could say, hey, you can charge me for usage. So if I'm using it for a month, I'm using it for a few weeks, just charge me for that particular point in time, and make sure that I can use Jboss AP. But right now, definitely for Jboss AP as well as for Webster, you do need to be an entitled user. So you need to enter your entitlement information. For WebLogic, that's not the case. For WebLogic, you can just get started, and you just have to make sure that you are licensed later on with Oracle. So again, once you have the cluster set up, you can begin doing your integrations. In this case, there is not integrations built into the solution itself, but you'll have to do the integrations yourself. There is an initial release that has been available for some time. There will be more releases and potentially more features and enhancements and bug fixes for this particular release. So that basically is a picture of what we offer in terms of the offers in virtual machines. Let's now move into something actually quite popular these days, and that is containers. So in fact, if we see it right now, the predominant business on Azure for Java still is virtual machine based, but it is just about to change. Huge demand and huge interest for container-based platforms, in particular Kubernetes-based platforms, we have quite a bit of demand around that. So because of this reason, Azure has made sure that Kubernetes is basically a very first-class citizen on Azure. So we have a number of very powerful, offerings around that, namely Azure Kubernetes Service, which is one of the top three Kubernetes providers, Kubernetes implementations out there running on the cloud. To go along with that, we also have Azure Container Registry. When you're doing these sorts of developments in an enterprise environment, you want your images to be in a secure repository, secure private repository, and that is where Azure Container Registry comes in. You can use it as a public repo if you like, but that's not the typical use case. Now, aside from that, one other thing that is just released and very, very interesting is Azure Container Apps. And let me explain Azure Container Apps for a second. So I think we all know Kubernetes. It's a container platform. It's a container orchestration platform. So it allows for a number of other things like self-healing, monitoring, management, and so on. But you do need to deal with Kubernetes as in its own primitives. And that makes a lot of sense when you are creating a highly orchestrated data center that has multiple components in it. But let's say your containerized deployments are very, very simple. And all you're really doing is deploying one application, and that one application has more than one instance to it. So that is a very good use case for Azure Container Apps. So in Azure Container Apps, you're not dealing with Kubernetes. What you're really doing is dealing with Docker instead. So all you're doing is creating a Docker image, and that Docker container image or some other container image, you can then tell Azure Container Apps, hey, please go deploy this image to the cloud and give me n number of instances of it, and build services around there, do integrations around there, and do the monitoring and management behind the scenes for me. I don't really want to deal with orchestration concerns. So that's Azure Container Apps. So similarly, we are trying to make sure that all of the major Java EE app servers are supported very well. On AKS in particular, we haven't really done enough work yet with Azure Container Apps because it just came out. But we have done a fair amount of work to get things supported on Azure Kubernetes Service. Now, the interesting part is that the Java EE application vendors actually have built-in support for Kubernetes for a while now. So they offer things like Docker images at the basic. Everybody does that. All of the Java EE application servers have official Docker images, officially supported Docker images. Some of them provide Helm charts to further make the installation of these app servers simple on Kubernetes. And some of them also provide operators, and that goes even a level higher, and ensures that there is a built-in bridge that is deployed right in the Kubernetes cluster that understands Kubernetes and understands the app server. So the app server, it's basically running almost natively. So it's, if you will, Kubernetes native app servers through these Kubernetes operators. So the major app servers all do some combination of that: WebLogic, OpenLiberty, Jboss AP, Wildfly, and Payara. We are making sure that we take those best practices and we take those tools that the app server vendors are providing, and it runs well and it runs as easily as possible on Azure. So a couple of different things we do here. We provide, first and foremost, we certify that these app servers work well on Azure. Second of all, we provide you step-by-step guidance on how to get started with each of these app servers. So let's say you want to start with WebLogic and AKS, so we have guidance for that. Let's say you want to start with Webster Liberty and get Webster Liberty started on AKS. Again, we provide you guidance for that. But similar to the virtual machine model, we actually go beyond that as well. So we do provide solution templates where you can ease the initial provisioning of all of these things and make that as easy and as painless as possible, also just by going through a UI experience in the Azure Marketplace or in the Azure portal. So let's dig in a bit deeper into all of that. Again, the most mature offering here is WebLogic on AKS because we started it as early as we could. So WebLogic provides a Kubernetes operator. It's a very robust Kubernetes operator. In fact, probably one of the most robust out there. So first and foremost, that is certified to be running on Azure well. In addition to that, we provide basic guidance. So if you want to be very manual and get everything started by yourself and do every little step, we provide guidance, step-by-step manual guidance on how to get started with WebLogic on AKS. But above and beyond that, we provide what's in the screenshot, as you can see. Similar to the virtual machines model, what we do is we do a whole bunch of provisioning, stuff that you usually, honestly, are not customizing that much. It's just unnecessary steps that you need to follow. So we are automating all of those things for you. So we are creating the AKS cluster. We are creating an Azure Container Registry for you. We are installing getting the WebLogic operator, installing the WebLogic operator on that cluster, and also installing the WebLogic itself or a custom Docker image that you want, either way. But we are basically getting you started with a WebLogic cluster running on AKS using the operator in the way that Microsoft and Oracle recommend. And again, these marketplace entries are published in the marketplace as well. And you can definitely give it a try using the link that I have here. For WebLogic, we do support a number of integrations built into the solution template. Namely, we do support load balancing, either using Azure Load Balancer or Azure App Gateway. Azure Load Balancer being an internal solution. If you're not publishing your application on the internet, that makes sense. Or Azure App Gateway. That's the load balancer that you would use if you had a public-facing site. And again, we're doing all of the setup and hooking up Azure App Gateway with AKS for you through the solution template. We also support things like the common databases again. So if you want a particular, if you're, let's say, connecting to Azure SQL, we'll download the driver for you, make sure that the driver is properly installed with the operator and with the Docker image. Similarly, we can enable app insights so that the information from the WebLogic operator lands in the monitoring console in Azure Monitor or Azure App Insights. And also, we can provision Azure files for you. So one of the biggest things that we see here is even though people are running AKS and they're running in a very ephemeral environment, in some cases, they still want to use a file system for various cases. So you can provision Azure Files, which is basically the distributed file system that you would need in an AKS-based environment, and we can provision that for you and load it up in your image. So there is an initial version out there for you to try out. Give it a try. Give us feedback. Take a look at how it feels. And see where the gaps are, where it's working, where it's not working. And there will, of course, be more maintenance releases for that and potentially some enhancements. For example, adding more services, perhaps. So we do the, again, very similar thing on the IBM side, okay, with Webster Liberty and Open Liberty. So again, we are deploying the operator, the AKS cluster, the Azure Container Registry, as well as the Liberty or Docker images. You can also deploy a custom Docker image, again, if you would like. Again, the operator is certified. The Webster Liberty operator is certified to run on AKS. And there's not a lot of integrations built into it right now. But once you get the basics set up in terms of the operator and the cluster, you can always add that, of course, yourself. And of course, you could give us feedback on what kind of other integrations you would like to see. For example, I do think that integrating App Gateway and Azure Load Balancer, just like we have for WebLogic, can make sense here. So again, initial release is out. Please give it a try. Please give us feedback on what you would like to see, and we will continue evolving this solution as well to make sure that it is a really nice solution for you if you are getting started with Webster Liberty or Open Liberty on AKS. So you'll notice that there is no solution for Jboss AP and Wildfly yet. Okay, so there's some very simple guidance that is to get started with Wildfly on AKS, but it's not as robust as what we have for Webster and WebLogic, and we certainly do not have a marketplace solution template for Jboss AP and Wildfly quite yet. But this is something that, based on your feedback, if this is something that you're interested in seeing, we could go pursue those paths, or at least maybe provide step-by-step guidance the same way that we do for Webster and WebLogic. So one of the more important container-based runtimes that does have some usage, we do see some usage on Azure is Openshift. So we have supported the same way that we have a managed version of Kubernetes. We've actually provided a managed version of Openshift for a while. It's called Azure Red Hat Openshift, and it is developed in collaboration with Red Hat. So the OpenShift and Azure Red Hat OpenShift do provide some benefits. So first and foremost, it enables scenarios like multi-cloud deployment, particularly hybrid deployment. So you could be running on-premise, OpenShift on-premise, and OpenShift on Azure, and it's basically the same interface. It allows you some flexibility to move between cloud providers, same way that Kubernetes does. You could also be, it's also a useful bridge for somebody to start on premise and then move to the cloud, but still continue to use the same interface. So again, generally what happens is Kubernetes is, OpenShift is really just an abstraction rather, OpenShift is really just an abstraction over Kubernetes. So all of the work that app server vendors generally do for Kubernetes applies here. And in case of some app server vendors like IBM and Jboss and Red Hat, they actually provide some value add, more targeted towards OpenShift. For example, there's an OpenShift technology called source to image, and the source to image technology really works very well with Jboss EAP, for example. So again, over here, we are making sure that these pathways are also enabled for customers. And again, we have more robust solutions, in particular for the IBM runtimes, Webster Liberty and Open Liberty, and not very robust guidance or marketplace solutions yet for Jboss AP and Wildfly. But again, if your feedback is that's something that you would like to see, we would like to hear from you. And so that we can begin working with Red Hat and fulfilling those gaps as well, and maybe create either marketplace entries or guidance or both, targeting Jboss AP and/or Wildfly on ARO or OpenShift. So this is what we have at the moment. We released this the same time as we released our Webster Liberty and Open Liberty on AKS offering. So again, certified operator is certified. In this case, it is provisioning the ARO cluster rather than the AKS cluster. It is creating the OpenShift container registry, enabling that behind the scenes for you, as opposed to the Azure container registry. We are creating what's called a project, or in Kubernetes terms, a namespace for you, securing that, so allowing you to log into that, because in ARO, generally, you will create an application in a particular project or namespace. And again, allowing you to, on top of the operator itself, allow you to deploy one or more instances of Liberty using the Liberty or Liberty Docker image. So you can specify the Docker image that you would like to use. And again, we do provide step-by-step guidance on all of that to do that as well. So if you, for some reason, you don't want to use the solution template, you can always use the manual guidance that will take you through every single step of setting this up by yourself. But the solution template is a much easier way to do that. So again, other than the setting up the cluster, it's then up to you to do most of the integrations. And again, it may make sense to add more integrations here. For example, you could definitely conceive of adding the app gateway and Azure load balancer integration here as well. So you can definitely take a look at that. There's a screenshot and there's a link for you to try it out and give us feedback. All right, so managed services. This is a very important part of Azure. So if you were to say, what makes Azure truly special? What makes it so much better than, let's say, AWS? I would say it is this. So we are very good at providing taking the popular runtimes and then offering them as a managed service. So you're not dealing with Kubernetes or VMs or anything else like that. You just go on and say, hey, I want a managed offering, let's say for Jboss AP, and we will create that cluster for you, and we will do that deployment for you, do auto updates. You don't even have access to, you don't even have to bother with access to the underlying Kubernetes cluster or underlying virtual machines, because we do all of that for you via PaaS or managed service. So I can confidently say that Azure is the only top tier cloud that provides a managed service for Java EE, and that is Jboss EAP on App Service. And frankly, by the way, we can say the same thing for Spring, because we have another managed service called Spring Cloud Service for Spring developers, just like we have Jboss EAP for Jboss EAP on App Service for Java EE developers as managed services. So this is a offering that is jointly developed by Red Hat and Microsoft. Again, as you are using the service, you are billed within the service for Jboss EAP licenses. So you're running licensed versions of Jboss EAP, and you're paying for what you use. And it supports things like auto deployments, scaling up and down. It is monitored. You can add security. You can add update notifications, and the runtime will do the update for you if you need to. So there is a few limitations of this. It is currently stateless, so it only runs standalone instances, standalone configuration instances of Jboss EAP, not clusters in instances quite yet. And by the way, this is also load balanced, so it's automatically load balanced. You don't even have to provision anything. It's just whenever you say you want instances of Jboss EAP, it creates it for you, auto scales for you, and puts a load balancer for you all under the hood. All you get is an HTTP endpoint in the end. So App Service, Jboss AP for App Service, again, integrates very well with Maven. We provide Maven plugins for it. You can integrate it with GitHub Actions if you like. And it also provides integrations with the popular IDEs, in particular Visual Studio for Code. There is a whole set of plugins that is targeting simply support for App Service, including support for Jboss EAP on App Service. Again, you get the standalone configuration by default. You can modify the configuration. You don't have access to the console, Jboss console, but you do have access to the CLI. So you can modify your deployments using the CLI in a clustered fashion. So in the future, we could do more enhancements of Jboss EAP on App Service. Again, it depends on what you need and what your input to us actually is. So for example, we could potentially add support for Wildfly. We could potentially add support for stateful clusters, and so on. So it just depends on what you would want us to do, and we really need your feedback in order to make all of that happen. So one thing that a lot of people don't know is that we actually have a managed JMS service on Azure as well. So Azure Service Bus is the general service bus technology that we use on Azure. And it has a JMS binding, so we added JMS binding. So instead of using, say ActiveMQ or some other messaging technology, you could be using a managed service, a PaaS service on Azure. You could just be spinning up Azure Service Bus, and Azure Service Bus now speaks JMS. So you could configure Jboss AP or WebLogic or Webster to speak to Azure Service Bus via JMS. All right, so there is, if you want to get a feel for how things look like for Java developers on Azure, I actually have an end-to-end example. I won't have time to demo this because I'm almost out of time. But you can log on onto this GitHub repository, and you can go through step by step and set up an entire environment locally on your IDE and on the cloud using, in this case, Wildfly and AKS, and do an entire demo using a database, using logging solutions, and using GitHub Actions to do CI/CD. So it's a good end-to-end example, I believe. If you've never tried Azure before and you're new to Azure and you're a Java EE developer, or maybe even just a Java developer, you could log on onto this repository and do the Azure setup yourself and get an experience for how that looks like. So we'll finish up by doing a roadmap. As I talked about, we're in pretty good condition for a lot of these offerings. And I'll let you take a look at this later on. But basically, as you can see, most of the pathways are relatively clear. We at least have a decent enough solution for each of these app servers. There are some gaps, so namely Wildfly on virtual machines, getting Wildfly and Jboss AP guidance, and perhaps even better tooling to get started on both of those runtimes for either AKS or Openshift. Those are some areas of improvement that we could potentially be working on if that is something that you would like to see. So WebLogic and Azure roadmap, I think we're relatively mature here. So we provide all kinds of integration solutions. The marketplace solution does a decent job of a lot of these integrations, particularly for virtual machines. Where the work is likely in the future is seeing if we can make even better migration tooling that you just point into your existing VM-based solution, and we automatically port that for you, automatically port your application to Azure for you, and also potentially providing more integration support in the AKS solution, and providing more guidance around those solutions as well. Same kind of story for Webster. So we have the basic enablement done. We could potentially do some automation around the transformation advisor on Azure, and we could be providing more support for all of the different type of service integrations, either baked into the solution templates or through guidance, or maybe both. So we could be doing integration with Azure Active Directory and Liberty, Azure Redis and Liberty, and so on. All right. So to summarize, I'm almost out of time here. There's a dedicated team working on Java EE on Azure Success. We want to hear from you. We want to help you. In fact, if you need help, we will provide you free guidance and free migration assistance during the time that we're doing this active development to ensure that Java EE is successful on Azure. If you want that assistance, free guidance, and free migration assistance, all you need to do is fill out the survey that is in the slide deck. A lot of the use cases, the basic use cases, are enabled already, okay, particularly for Webster and WebLogic, and in some cases, Jboss AP and Wildfly. There is a top tier a public cloud service for Java EE, namely Jboss AP on App Service. Again, we could use your feedback there and improve that further. And we'll continue to work probably on integrations, on enabling integrations in a better way, so that once you migrate these Java EE applications, you can begin to make use of services on Azure. All right, so I'll leave you with some resources here. These are more details on some of the offerings that I talked about already during the presentation. Feel free to take a look at those on your own time. But with that, let me stop sharing, and there is, I believe, just about 2 minutes, or maybe not even 2 minutes, for some Q&A. So I'll take some questions for you the best I can. Francisco, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that thank you for this impressive presentation of what Azure is actually doing for Java EE developers. So we do have one question. I'm sure if you saw it earlier.
I didn't.
Well, I'm gonna post it here on the. It says, in which cases is better option to deploy an application in WebLogic for containers instead of a traditional microservice based on HTTP native?
So a lot of our customers, they have these WebLogic applications that are 10, 15, 20 years old. These are massive applications that make money, and they're being actively developed. It doesn't really make sense to rewrite the entire application from scratch and incur maybe years of development costs. And at the end of that, you may not even get the full functionality that you started with in these applications. So for these type of applications, it doesn't make sense to do a wholesale rewrite. So that's the kind of applications where people are doing some more modest, some smaller enhancements to their application, perhaps upgrading it to the latest version of WebLogic, upgrading it to the latest version of Jakarta EE, maybe making use of some microprofile technologies, as opposed to wholesale rewriting the application. And in the process, they can containerize this application to give it more dynamism, and to run it in a more modern way on the cloud. So that is the differential. If you don't want to do a wholesale rewrite of your application, One option is to do a more smaller scale modernization of these mission critical applications, and then containerize these applications and move them into AKS. And a number of our customers are doing exactly that.
Yeah, that's a great answer. This is a very common question that people face when you get to see a new technology, something that actually is helping other developers. They always are talking about should we migrate everything we have to this new technology, or it depends a lot of as you were saying. I mean, it doesn't make sense if you have to rewrite, I don't know, 10 years of work into a new technology because it's not going to provide any short-term benefit to the company. So yeah, that was a question that we had, and I don't think we have another one, but I appreciate your time and actually all this information that you're sharing about how Azure is actually helping. And I heard that you say that there is actually free guidance that is very important for people who's actually trying to migrate to, or want to do something, start testing, start trying. So
Definitely, we provide architecture guidance. We provide engineering help in some cases with proof of concepts, and all of that is free because we're in early stage of doing this work. So all people need to do is fill out the survey, and then we'll be in touch and provide whatever assistance is necessary for those migrations.
okay, thank you very much, then, Reza. Well, hope you guys, everyone which is watching this conference, this talk, is really enjoy this, and see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time indeed. Have a good day.